A housing need is for families and low and moderate income people. And the word affordability hides the fact that the buildings that we're building are not affordable to the average New Yorker. Uh, One of the things that I'm proposing is the idea of decades of intentional neglect lead to the idea that we use it as a reparations payment in addition to the commitment of eliminating the privatization of public housing and keeping it public. Now, whether or not we'll win this New York State transfer tax, that's a debate. And if we set aside 5% of $16 billion, plus whatever money the city now allocates to public housing, it's in the nature of 3.6 to $4 billion a year. So I propose that the mayor would immediately establish a dedicated task force to oversee the fund allocation and project management, talk to some of the leaders in the financial community, and garner their support for utilizing the New York State stock transfer tax, because it's a way of actually taxing the wealthy in a way that begins to tax speculation and capital to benefit low and moderate income people. We have to remember that enslaved people built the wall of Wall Street. And even as George Washington took his oath of office in 1789, it took place in an area which 30 years earlier was the site of the city's slave market. So from a point of equity and social justice, there's a strong argument for reparations, but there's also a strong argument to recommit to the New Deal perspective of providing everybody with a decent home to live in. And I think that's as important. And by putting the two together, I believe that we can really use this as a way of generating the resources upfront, not over time, but upfront to rehabilitate and preserve this important public housing. I've been a planner working in New York City, primarily as an advocate planner working with community-based organizations since the mid-60s. Had the honor of serving on the New York City Planning Commission. I was appointed by David Dinkins in 1990 and served through to 1996 when I was not reappointed by Rudolph Giuliani, because I was basically independent of his way of thinking. The problems with New York City housing, public housing, began in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan initiating on the federal levels some draconian cutbacks to public housing, but not only cutbacks in funding, but an effort to begin to privatize that important housing stock. And since then, I've been among those who fought against the privatization of public housing, although public housing has not been a major focus for me for a number of years. However, when I sat through the meeting that Caitlin had and the residents of public housing last week, I was really reminded of the importance that public housing plays in our society and the commitment that were made in the early 30s on for the right to housing in the United States. And the right to housing is a public commitment. And that commitment has not been held up over all these years. It started with the Reagan cuts, which cut back and started the process that is now coming to fruition, which is the privatization of public housing. But it was also accelerated by Giuliani when he was mayor by destroying the quality of people who worked at the New York City Housing Authority, with some minor exceptions, like David Burney, who was the architect for a number of years there. The fact of the matter is that over the year, there have been enormous cutbacks in the maintenance and operation that has contributed to the decline of the quality of living for many of the residents in public housing. Public housing is not housing. It's actually homes for low and moderate income people in New York City. And we have to start thinking about the recreation and the protection of people's homes rather than just thinking of this in terms of a quantitative aspect of housing units. These are homes for people. And so one of the things I was caught up in that is that a lot of the people who are trying to repair the situation that now affects public housing do so only believing that the way to do it is by privatizing the housing and getting private money in it so it can be better managed and more and and have the resources by which to fix it up. But that will destroy the public function of public housing. So what I propose is, and I'll try to summarize it, is that we have a reparations initiative. Think about this as reparation to the residents and the home occupants of public housing for all of the misdeeds and misguided policies that have affected their lifestyle for the last 45 years. And it seems to me that using the reparations argument, coupled with money that could come from the New York State dock transfer tax, which I've been an advocate of reusing since 1990, and on record right after 9/11, of really using it to benefit the physical stock and the well-being of New York City. One of the things we could do is make this housing a commitment to the public sector, using not just the money flowing each year from the New York State New York State stock transfer tax, but using that tax and committing 20 years of that to a bond that will be fully paid back by the stock transfer tax over a 20-year period. And that would enable us to generate something like $55 billion today that we can begin to use to fix up and upgrade all of the homes that now exist in the housing supply. And that would be done in concert with the people who are living there. Now, whether or not we'll win this New York State stock transfer tax, that's a debate. And if we set aside 5% of $16 billion, plus whatever money the city now allocates to public housing, it's in the nature of $3.6 to $4 billion a year. If we appropriate it each year and not leverage it, we'll wind up having to defer the repair. And during the time that we defer it, we build up additional costs due to continued deterioration of the housing stock. And we also subject it to increased inflation over that period of time. If we begin to look at it and begin to enter into contract to repair all of it in concert with the tenants who live there, up front, we will save money over that period of time. And the way to do that is to make a 20-year commitment of what would be $3 to $4 billion a year coming from the state. And whether it's all from the New York State stock transfer tax or whatever, it should be paid for by the state as reparations for the people who live there. And so that one of the things that I'm proposing is the idea of decades of intentional neglect lead to the idea that we use it as a reparations payment in addition to the commitment of sustaining eliminating the privatization of public housing and keeping it public. And so it's led to the racial wealth gap and inequality. It's been systemic discrimination since most of the tenants are Black and Latino and poor. And it would avoid the root shock of the destruction of communities that we saw so evidently presented by the leadership of the people the other day in the housing in your community. So I think we need to go beyond acknowledging the problem and talk about restitution and reparation, and that the program should enable each of New York City's housing authority projects or estates to undergo infrastructure repairs and upgrades once a bond issue is approved and the participatory rehabilitation process gains acceptance by a supermajority of the tenants who live there, not just by a mere majority and not by a survey, a small survey that you then parade as proof that there's participation. And so one of the things that this will result in is, if we were able to do that, is we could improve living conditions for close to 400,000 residents, reduction in lead poisoning, mold, and respiratory health issues. We can enhance community spaces and social services. We can increase energy efficiency and reduce carbon footprint and reduce the ongoing maintenance and operation of these buildings by using sustainable development techniques to upgrade these buildings. Everything from new kinds of appliances to new ways of insulating the building. We can also use it as a way of addressing some of the poverty that exists in the city by generating both jobs for people who live in public housing as well as others, so they no longer remain poor. And we begin to address the issue of poverty, and that we preserve affordable housing. And I really want to, we preserve low and moderate income housing for future generations. I think it's really important to do that. So I propose that the mayor would immediately establish a dedicated task force to oversee the fund allocation and project management, talk to some of the leaders in the financial community, and garner their support for utilizing the New York State stock transfer tax, because it's a way of actually taxing the wealthy without, in a way that begins to tax speculation and capital to benefit low and moderate income people. And quite frankly, with artificial intelligence, the number of jobs that are going to be created in the future that we now consider middle income jobs and a rung on the ladder towards financial security is going to be withdrawn. It's one thing and an important thing to fight for jobs, but we also have to fight for the democratization of capital. And this is a way of using capital to benefit people in a much better way if we began to utilize the New York State stock transfer tax to benefit low and moderate income residents. And in the process, this becomes somewhat, as I write, poetic justice. We have to remember that enslaved people built the Wall of Wall Street. And even as George Washington took his oath of office in 1789, it took place in an area which 30 years earlier was the site of the city slave market. So from a point of equity and social justice, there's a strong argument for reparations, but there's also a strong argument to recommit to the New Deal perspective of providing everybody with a decent home to live in. And I think that's as important. And by putting the two together, I believe that we can really use this as a way of generating the resources up front, not over time, but up front to rehabilitate and preserve this important public housing stock. And so I very quickly went through the presentation, but it's basically saying that we can't defer the maintenance over 10 or 15 years. What we need to do is begin immediately to work with the residents of each of the housing projects in New York City and develop with them strategies to rehabilitate their housing and have the resources available from the public sector to enable them to do that without in any way billing them for the past mistakes and having government pick up the tab in its entirety. Again, I believe housing is a right and not a benefit. It is a right for everybody to have, and we have to start thinking of housing as a right and not as a commodity. And unfortunately, we still think of it as a commodity, and we still think about it, even when we're talking about addressing the housing issue in New York City, we think about it in quantitative terms, not in qualitative terms. What we really want to do is build homes and communities and what we heard from the people who were living in public housing at Caitlin's meeting and the meeting of a group that's fighting for the preservation in your community was that basically these are their homes. There is a commitment of the people there to stay, and we need to work with them. Housing shouldn't be thought of as a filing cabinet for people. Housing should be homes for people in a community where their neighbor is somewhat meaningful. When you build a 6-story building and there's no connection between looking out the window and seeing your kids on the street, there's something wrong. One of the early things I did was take Robert Kennedy through Bedford-Stuyvesant before the formation of Bedford Restoration. It was I remember standing in front of a building and a woman yelled out of her window to the people who were assembled below and said, "When you build housing, make sure I can look at my child playing on the street from my window." And I think we have to somehow realize that when you're building housing, we really need to build communities. And our housing shortage in New York is not for luxury housing, it's for families. Our housing need is for families and low and moderate income people. And the word affordability hides the fact that the buildings that we're building are not affordable to the average New Yorker.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And if you go over to Chelsea and that public housing, it's beautiful. You got the grounds, you got the trees, you got the playgrounds, and it spells community and families. And
And
I
it has memory.
yeah, yeah,
It has
absolutely,
memory.
absolutely. We put our roots there. And I see Alex has a hand up. Alex,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Has there been any feedback from non-New York City public housing? I would imagine no. If not, how do you think they will respond to, 5% being earmarked for NYCHA? And then what about them? Or do they just not know?
Yeah, so the 5% is, but the community housing renewal. Let me pull up the exact breakdown, because the way that Phil designed the bill is that there is money for downstate housing. Yep, and then there's also 5% for upstate housing. So it is equal. The way that Phil designed the bill was to kind of fund different programs upstate and downstate, to garner the most support, so that upstate communities would benefit from it. Same with downstate communities. So it was designed deliberately in a way to touch on both upstate and downstate.
Ron, what do you think about all this talk about social housing support? This is like public housing is the perfect example. That's what we should all be perfecting and living by, wouldn't you say?
I think the reason the word social housing has been developed is because uh, public housing as a name has gotten a bad rap over the last decade. But it is housing in the public sector that social housing is, and what I don't care what we call it, whether it's public housing or social housing or whatever. I think we need to make sure that it is committed to meeting the needs of low and moderate income families and low income single people. It cannot be used as a whitewashing, literally, of the term, because the privatization of housing is absolutely wrong. And what we need to do here is, first and foremost, keep the housing stock that we now have in good repair and operational. The thing that made Mayor Koch's housing program somewhat successful is that what he did to address the housing supply was to stop and stem the bleeding on the loss of affordable housing. If we keep building new housing units and lose the affordable housing units that we have, the truly affordable housing units, the low-income housing units that we have, we will not be addressing the problem. So we have to stop the hemorrhaging. And the way to do it is to protect our low-income housing supply. And that is it. And then you can call it social housing if you want. And then we have to expand that supply in whatever we build, again, because housing is a right. And we need to make sure we have the families in New York City. Families are leaving New York City quickly, not millionaires. Last month, we had the greatest number of units being sold just the other day in Cranes of units selling for more than $4 million. It was the largest number. So even if we have a socialist mayor, the billionaires are moving to New York City. And the people who are being pushed out to Pennsylvania and other places are low and moderate income people who then have to commute into the city where they have their job. They're the people who built the city. There are parents, there are neighbors, and there are new neighbors as well. And we have to make sure we have a social housing program for the future, but we have to preserve the one we have as a foundation and then build and expand upon it.
Yeah.
That answers your question. But I do believe we need to build, we have to embrace a social housing program in New York State. We have to make sure we avoid the segregation patterns that took place in the past. And there's one other point which I didn't make, and that was that everybody makes money in housing except for low-income people. And it's about time we made sure that the housing benefits our low-income population in more ways than just creating a home, but also in generating jobs and in generating and giving them the ability for their children. As many of the folks pointed out, from Chelsea, that their children went to college, that their children are breaking out of poverty. That was a mission that was part of that social compact that we made in the 30s that we're not living up to any longer. And we have to re-engage that social contract.
You're not going to get any arguments here. I agree to ask.
Yeah, thank you, John. I just agree entirely with the case that Ron's been making, but I had a question for Dylan, which is that last time I heard from Dylan and from Assemblymember Steck, which was many months ago now, the SDT legislation that the Assemblyman was promoting was being blocked from getting on the agenda by Speaker Heastie because he was favoring various other tax the rich schemes that other Assembly members had proposed that he favored over the SDT. So my question is, what are the prospects of getting the SDT onto the legislative agenda in 2026?
To kind of best answer what the true obstacle is, the New York State Democratic Assembly Campaign Committee just spent $1 million on an assembly race in Plattsburgh, New York, and won. And you don't generate $1 million in the North Country with just small donations. While all the Wall Street firms donate to the Democratic Assembly Campaign Committee, which is controlled by the Speaker is very hostile towards it because Wall Street's hostile to it, and they donate to the Assembly campaign committees. The Speaker doesn't even want to do any revenue raisers in the budget. He's not even open to a small corporate tax hike. The governor also holds the same mindset that we cannot raise taxes. We don't need to. So the answer, unfortunately, is the Speaker is very much opposed to it. Not only this, but any other revenue raiser, because he's argued in conference that, if we raise the corporate tax rate by a little, everybody's going to go to New Jersey. So the Speaker is still of the mindset that we can't raise taxes because he makes the argument it's going to hurt business competition in New York State. But the real answer is that if you follow the campaign contributions, all of those individuals and corporations donate to the Assembly Campaign Committee, which is controlled by him. So that's kind of the unfortunate, very long answer to it. Where it stands, we have gotten around 7 new co-sponsors from the bill since we last spoke. So we are trying to make progress with that. But the real opposition and reason why it's not moving, we believe, comes down to the campaign contributions.
Yeah, I was hoping for a less depressing answer, but I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the
very
depressing
accurate.
answer, but that's the kind of the unfortunate, honest answer with the current dynamics right now.
Well, that's the reason that I framed my proposal as a reparations article, because the same leadership set up a committee for reparations. All right. And there is a state committee that has been formed to deal with reparations in the state of New York. I also, in the writing of this, proposed that the mayor convene and meet with some of the leadership in the Wall Street, the same way he was willing to meet with some of the idiotic leadership in Washington. I'm talking about the president of the United States, and talk to some of the more progressive folks, including 1 or 2 members of the of Wall Street who actually grew up in public housing. I think the guy from Goldman Sachs, I forgot his name, one of the houses actually grew up in public housing, to see whether or not dedicating this money as part of the transfer tax to that purpose might not soften their opposition, because it's a de minimis tax. It is so it's really de minimis. The major opposition may actually come from our trade unions, because a lot of the investments they have for retirement funds are would pay much larger amounts of money. But you can even counter that argument by saying if you use it correctly in New York City, it will leverage a lot more in terms of housing loans, in terms of packaging the loans, in terms of construction jobs, so that it will mitigate any loss that they'll have, because of the volume when you're investing in capital it seeds an economic boom. I think that if you read the proposal, I try to address some of those as a way of really softening the opposition to the transfer tax. Years ago, when Mario Cuomo was governor, we proposed a special housing trust fund. We didn't get it based on what we said should be the sources, but the state felt that it was a very good program, so they found other revenue sources to make up for it. So I think we need to make the fight for the upfront costs and guaranteeing the repayment, whether or not it's the stock transfer tax or just taking what really is our annual dedication to public housing, both on the state and city level, and using it to back a bond that we allow for upfront investment, so we don't defer and kick the football down a number of years.
So to your point about Wall Street, and again, I have an unfortunate, depressing but honest answer. Goldman Sachs is absolutely opposed to it. We just had a meeting with a bunch of top people from Wall Street. Phil was at a hearing. It was me and 10 other of them. I don't know if there could potentially be someone out in Wall Street that would be open to that argument, but they are absolutely against that argument, even when you make the argument to them that it's going to better the state and in the city. They do not buy that argument. They are still of the mindset that this is going to be the worst thing ever for Wall Street. I think it's a very good idea to try to, get somebody on Wall Street, who is for it, but the problem is, in our conversations with everybody that we've met with on Wall Street, they are adamantly against it. And to the point about the mayor, when Mr. Mandami was in the assembly, he did not support the stock transfer tax, because at the time, the downstate DSA had a proposal that it wasn't just to reinstate it like Phil is thinking. The DSA one was very elaborate, went very far beyond what the state did. And the mayor was at the time not supportive of it at all. And I know we have tried outreaching to his team about it. We have not gotten anywhere. I do know that, he is pushing for some revenue raisers, which is, great, but he has not supported this. He has not voiced his support for it. And I think, again, to your point, it would be great to have somebody like on Wall Street advocating for it. We've tried making that argument to them every time we meet with them. They will not buy it. They're convinced that this bill will, be the death of America, which is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
But it's the very sad reality that we're in.
I think when we talk about the Wall Street, it's almost as if, you heard the term where politicians will make me do it. We need the people. We need the critical mass. I don't think it works the same for the Wall Street. I think they're not going to budge.
Conversations, super interesting, I guess. Yeah, I think Wall Street's right. The problem, right? So but I'm just thinking about how we, so I put this in the chat, but the Residents to Preserve Public Housing, including Renee, who is the president of the Elliott Chelsea Residents Association and one of the key leaders in the fight against the demolition of public housing in Chelsea, but is very, have been pushing for the stock transfer taxes. There's all these kind of groups but we're not coordinated together. So I feel like we really need to build the people power. Ron, I saw your draft proposal. I don't know when or how we can get it out and get folks behind it, because I think it's so strong, and coordinate our efforts from across NYCHA residents. I think the language of reparations and calling out the systemic racism that is causing the disinvestment or used as justification for the disinvestment will be is something that I think every NYCHA resident knows, right?
Unfortunately, I have to leave because I have an appointment that I have to get to in Manhattan. But I do want to make one last comment. There is a segment of a comedian's comment, a British comedian that I'll send to you later on today, where he meets with he's actually meeting with a banker in London and talking about the stock transfer tax. And the guy comes out blatantly against it. And then he tells him, how much do you think it will cost on a $100,000 transaction? And the guy puts out a figure. And the real figure is a fraction of what they perceive it to be. And after that, it's a comedian's routine, but it's began to change in that way that the stock market in London started looking at it. The fact of the matter is that New York State stock transfer tax existed until 1983, from the 20s, I believe. And the stock market boomed in all those years, and they didn't get up and move.
Reparations Commission, and we were told in May of last year that that is an independent commission. It's not like the state tries to keep their distance from that, and we have that on replay because it was a special guest, and she was from the Office of African American Affairs of Kathy Hochul's executive chamber. Is there something that I'm missing? Is there an actual state commission?
No, I think we still should make that argument.
Renee?
The big suggestion is that you need to reverse the 10% from the MTA and put it towards NYCHA. 5% is far too little.
I understand that. We designed the bill in a way that every program was getting some funding. And so we just thought that the MTA getting the 10% funding would be more persuasive to the speaker. The allocation, this is kind of just a draft. I mean, if the bill were to pass, we would be open to tweaking it. But we just thought that, at the time when it was written, we, talked to transportation experts and everybody, and it seemed like kind of the biggest need was the funding for the MTA at the time. We did make a change for the NYCHA that it would go right to the Section 9 housing. I mean, the numbers, if we're definitely open to changing them since we made the tweak to the NYCHA numbers. But, we would expect that if the bill were to be put on the floor, that there would be some changes to the allocation.
Okay, nice. Dylan, can I call upon you to be involved with some further discussions on how it may tie in with Ron?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, good. Terrific.